The Mojave Desert blazed under the relentless afternoon sun, a vast expanse of sand and stone stretching toward the horizon like a golden ocean frozen in time. Lyra's small research vessel trembled as it pierced Earth's atmosphere, warning lights flashing across her control panel. This wasn't part of the mission plan. Navigation systems failing, announced the ship's AI in the melodic language of her home world. Atmospheric composition incompatible with current stabilization parameters. Lyra's six-fingered hands moved gracefully across the holographic interface, her iridescent skin reflecting the emergency lights in shimmering patterns of blue and violet. She had studied Earth for years through transmitted data, but nothing compared to seeing it firsthand, even if that view was rapidly approaching at dangerous velocity. "Recalibrate landing trajectory," she commanded, her voice calm despite the circumstances. "Locate minimal population density for emergency touchdown." The ship's scanners identified a remote area with no human settlements, but the vessel's declining power meant precision was becoming impossible. As she broke through the cloud layer, Lyra caught her first glimpse of the desert, beautiful and terrifying in its vastness. Miles away, Marcus Reynolds adjusted the lens on his camera, focusing on a rare desert tortoise making its slow journey across the rocky terrain. At 35, he had built a reputation as one of the Southwest's premier wildlife photographers, though few understood his preference for solitude out here in the emptiness. "That's it, old-timer," he murmured to the tortoise. "Just pretend I'm not even here." The first indication of something amiss was the change in air pressure. Marcus felt it in his ears, a subtle pop followed by a low, distant rumble that seemed to come from everywhere at once. The tortoise retreated into its shell as Marcus looked up, noticing dark clouds gathering with unnatural speed. "That's not right," he said, checking the weather app on his phone. Clear skies had been forecast for the entire week. The wind picked up suddenly, swirling dust around him as he packed his equipment. What had begun as a perfect photography day was rapidly deteriorating into something he'd never experienced before, a storm forming in minutes rather than hours. Inside her failing craft, Lyra braced for impact as the ship's remaining systems struggled against the suddenly emerging weather phenomenon. Her species' technology had advanced far beyond Earth's, but even their ships weren't designed to handle unexpected planetary defense systems. "Warning, atmospheric disturbance detected," the AI informed her. "Unknown energy signature interfering with stabilization fields." The crash was inevitable now. Lyra secured her emergency beacon and research data, preparing for the worst. Her mission to observe Earth discreetly had clearly failed, but survival protocol remained the priority. The impact came with a deafening roar as the ship plowed into the desert floor, skidding nearly half a mile before coming to rest partially buried in sand. The protective gel surrounding Lyra's command chair absorbed much of the shock, but the violent landing still left her momentarily stunned. Meanwhile, Marcus had taken shelter in his jeep as the sudden sandstorm reduced visibility to near zero. Through the swirling dust and debris, he caught a glimpse of something impossible, a streak of blue-white light cutting through the clouds, followed by an impact tremor that rocked his vehicle. "What the hell was that?" he whispered, gripping the steering wheel. Against all better judgment, Marcus started the engine. Whatever had just crashed might need help, or documentation. Either way, his curiosity overrode his caution as he slowly navigated through the storm, following the trajectory of the light he'd witnessed. As the winds intensified, Lyra emerged from her damaged vessel, her environmental suit deploying automatically. Earth's atmosphere was breathable for her species, but the swirling dust and debris would damage her sensitive respiratory system. She needed to find shelter and assess the damage to her ship. The extraction beacon was intact, but with communications damaged, there was no way to know if her distress signal had reached her homeworld. The desert storm, now at full fury, concealed her presence, a small mercy in an otherwise disastrous situation. As Lyra took her first steps on Earth soil, the reality of her predicament became clear. She was stranded on a potentially hostile planet, with no immediate hope of rescue. Little did she know that through the howling winds and blinding sand, someone was already heading her way. The sandstorm howled with increasing fury as Marcus navigated his jeep through the treacherous terrain. Visibility had dropped to mere feet, but the GPS coordinates he'd marked after seeing the strange light kept him oriented toward his destination. Years of desert experience had taught him respect for these sudden storms. They could strip paint from metal and flesh from bone if one wasn't careful. "This is insane," he muttered, wiping condensation from the inside of his windshield. The temperature differential between the scorching exterior and his air-conditioned cabin created a foggy barrier that further complicated his journey. A flash of something reflective caught his eye through the swirling sand, something that didn't belong in this natural landscape. Marcus slowed the vehicle and reached for his high-powered flashlight, aiming it toward the anomaly. The beam cut through the dust to reveal a metallic surface unlike anything he'd seen before, partially buried in the desert floor. "Holy!" The words died in his throat as his light traced the contours of what could only be described as a small aircraft, though its design defied conventional aeronautics. No wings, no visible propulsion system, just smooth, curved surfaces that seemed to absorb and reflect light simultaneously. That's when he saw her. A figure stumbled through the storm, clearly disoriented. Even through the dust, Marcus could tell this was no ordinary desert hiker. The proportions were human-like, but something about the movement was distinctly different, more fluid, almost weightless despite the battering winds. Without hesitation, Marcus threw open his door, securing a bandana over his nose and mouth before venturing into the maelstrom. The sand felt like thousands of tiny needles against his exposed skin as he fought his way toward the figure. "Hey!" he shouted, his voice immediately swallowed by the roaring wind. "Over here." Lyra's environmental suit provided limited protection against the storm, but its diagnostic functions had been compromised in the crash. Her vision blurred as fine particles bypassed her face shield, irritating her sensitive eyes. The atmospheric composition readings fluctuated wildly, higher oxygen levels than her species was accustomed to making her lightheaded. A sound cut through the storm, something distinctly non-mechanical. Lyra froze, her training kicking in. First contact protocols specified observation before interaction, but circumstances had eliminated that luxury. She turned toward the sound and saw a figure approaching, unmistakably human. Marcus reached her just as she swayed dangerously. Without thinking, he wrapped an arm around her waist to steady her, immediately noticing the unusual texture of her suit, if it was a suit at all. It seemed to shift under his touch, adapting to pressure. "I've got you," he said, though he doubted she could hear him over the storm. "My jeep's just over there. We need to get out of this." Lyra understood the intent if not the words. The human was offering assistance, not showing aggression. With her ship damaged and the storm intensifying, accepting help represented her best chance of survival. She allowed herself to be guided toward the human's transport vehicle. Once inside the jeep, the sudden silence as Marcus closed the door was almost as disorienting as the storm itself. Lyra's face shield retracted automatically in the safer environment, revealing her features for the first time. Marcus stared, unable to hide his shock. Her skin shimmered with subtle iridescence, and her eyes, larger than human eyes and deep violet, blinked with vertical pupils that adjusted visibly to the cabin light. Not quite human, but hauntingly beautiful. "You're..." he began, struggling for words. "You're not from around here, are you?" Lyra touched her throat, activating her universal translator. It would be rudimentary at first, building its database of this human's language patterns with each exchange. "Ship damaged," she managed, her voice melodic with unusual harmonic overtones. "Storm unexpected." Marcus gripped the steering wheel tighter, knuckles widening. "I'd say so." He glanced toward the partially buried craft. "We can't stay here. Storm's getting worse, and if that thing is what I think it is, others will be coming soon." Government types who ask too many questions. Lyra followed his gaze, understanding dawning. Of course, Earth civilizations would be intensely interested in extraterrestrial technology. Her mission parameters explicitly forbade allowing such access. She nodded slowly. Not safe here, she agreed, her translator already improving. Need shelter. My cabin's about 40 minutes from here, Marcus said, starting the engine. Off-grid, no nearby neighbors. You'd be safe there until... He paused, realizing he had no frame of reference for what came next. Until we figure things out. As they drove away from the crash site, Lyra watched the storm engulf her ship, partially burying it under shifting sands, a small mercy that might delay discovery. She studied her unexpected rescuer's profile, strong jaw, weathered skin that spoke of years under harsh sun, eyes focused intently on the barely visible path ahead. The cabin of the vehicle felt impossibly intimate, two beings from different worlds sharing the same air. Marcus turned up the heater, noticing how she seemed to relax in the warmth. I'm Marcus, he said, touching his chest. Lyra, she responded, mimicking the gesture. Their eyes met, and something unspoken passed between them, the mutual recognition that everything had changed for both of them in ways neither could fully comprehend. Outside, the desert storm continued to rage, but inside the Jeep, a different kind of turbulence was just beginning. The first rays of dawn filtered through the wooden blinds of Marcus's cabin, casting golden stripes across Lyra's sleeping form. She lay on his couch wrapped in a blanket, her iridescent skin catching the light in mesmerizing patterns. Marcus watched from the kitchen doorway, coffee mug in hand, still processing the reality of his situation. An alien researcher was asleep in his living room, and somehow that fact seemed both extraordinary and strangely natural after their night of halting conversation. You're staring, Lyra said without opening her eyes, her translator now fluent enough to capture the subtle humor in her tone. Marcus smiled despite himself. Sorry. Not every day I rescue someone from another planet. Lyra sat up, the blanket sliding from her shoulders. Her environmental suit had reconfigured overnight into something more comfortable, a form-fitting garment that adapted to the cabin's temperature. Your shelter is interesting. Primitive but functional. Primitive? Marcus raised an eyebrow, glancing around his solar-powered cabin with its satellite internet and modern amenities. I guess everything's relative. I meant no offense, Lyra said, rising with that peculiar grace that made even simple movements seem choreographed. My world achieved sustainable fusion energy 300 of your Earth years ago. But there's elegance in simplicity. She ran her six-fingered hand along the wooden table. We no longer build with organic materials. Marcus set a second mug on the table. It's just hot water. I wasn't sure what you might be able to drink. Lyra approached, studying the steaming liquid. Her scanner analyzed its composition before she nodded. Water is universal. My biochemistry can process it. She took the mug, her fingers brushing against his. The contact sent an unexpected tingle up his arm. You feel it too, she observed, withdrawing her hand slightly. The bioelectric field. My species communicates partially through electromagnetic impulses. Is that what that was? Marcus found himself leaning toward her, drawn by something beyond curiosity. I thought it might be static electricity from the storm. Lyra's lips curved in what he was learning to recognize as a smile. Not exactly. She gestured toward the window. The storm has passed. I need to assess my ship's damage. Marcus nodded, though reluctance shadowed his expression. We should wait until nightfall. Less chance of being seen. They spent the day in a curious dance of cultural exchange. Lyra absorbed information about Earth with remarkable speed, asking questions that ranged from technological development to art and music. Marcus found himself sharing more than he had with anyone in years, his passion for wildlife photography, his retreat from urban life after a failed relationship, his connection to the desert's stark beauty. "You isolate yourself," Lyra observed as evening approached. "Yet humans are social creatures." Marcus looked up from the communication device they'd been attempting to repair, a small disk from her ship that might allow her to contact her people. "Sometimes being alone is easier than being misunderstood." "That sentiment transcends species," Lyra said softly. She moved to sit beside him on the workbench, her shoulder nearly touching his. "On my world, I'm considered unconventional. My fascination with other civilizations is seen as unnecessary. We have achieved near-perfect societal balance." "Sounds boring," Marcus commented, earning another of her almost smiles. "Perhaps that's why I volunteered for solo research missions." Her eyes met his, violet depths containing something vulnerable and familiar. Perfect societies leave little room for the unexpected. The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with unspoken awareness. Marcus found himself studying the curve of her lips, wondering if they would feel as warm as they looked. "Your respiratory rate has increased," Lyra noted, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "As has mine." Marcus set down the delicate tool he'd been using. "Is that part of your research data?" "No," she admitted. "That's personal observation." The distance between them disappeared by mutual gravitational pull. Their lips met tentatively at first, then with growing certainty. Her mouth was indeed warm, and tasted faintly of something sweet and unfamiliar. The bioelectric current between them intensified, creating a feedback loop of sensation that made Marcus gasp against her lips. Lyra's hands came up to frame his face, her touch feather-light yet somehow reaching beneath his skin to something deeper. Images flickered in his mind, fragments of her world, emotions without earth names, a connection that transcended physical boundaries. When they finally separated, both were breathing heavily. The repair tools lay forgotten on the workbench. "That was..." Marcus struggled for words. "A significant cultural exchange," Lyra finished, though the humor in her eyes belied the formal description. As dusk settled over the desert, they prepared to visit the crash site. The kiss remained unaddressed but not forgotten, hovering between them like a newly discovered constellation waiting to be mapped. They loaded Marcus's jeep with recovery equipment, their movements now synchronized as if they'd worked together for years rather than a day. When his hand brushed hers while securing a tarp, the connection sparked again, less overwhelming but no less profound. "Whatever happens," Marcus said as they pulled away from the cabin, "I'm glad that storm brought you here." Lyra studied his profile in the fading light, her scientific detachment increasingly compromised by unforeseen variables. "As am I," she responded, certain of at least that much in a situation filled with uncertainties. The desert stretched before them, stars beginning to emerge in the darkening sky, some of which might be visible from her world as well. Two beings from different planets, drawn together by cosmic chance and something that felt remarkably like destiny. The crash site looked markedly different in the moonlight. Wind-driven sand had partially buried Lyra's vessel, its sleek contours now hidden beneath dunes that made it resemble just another desert formation. Marcus killed the jeep's headlights as they approached, relying on the full moon's illumination to guide them the final 100 yards. "Good news," he whispered, though there was no one else for miles. "Looks like the storm did us a favor." Lyra nodded, her eyes adjusting to the darkness more quickly than his. Her species had evolved under a dimmer sun, giving her superior night vision. "We need to access the auxiliary power core. If it's intact, I can restore basic communication functions." They worked methodically, Marcus following her instructions to help excavate a specific section of the ship. The desert night had brought a profound chill, their breath forming small clouds in the air. Despite the cold, both were sweating from exertion by the time they reached the access panel. Lyra placed her palm against what appeared to be seamless metal. The surface responded to her touch, liquefying momentarily before sliding open to reveal a pulsing crystalline structure nestled among circuitry unfamiliar to human technology. "It's still functional," she breathed, relief evident in her voice. "Damaged, but reparable." Marcus watched in fascination as she manipulated components too small for his eyes to track properly. "How long before you can send a message?" "Hours, not days," she responded, concentrating on her task. "But there's a complication. The signal will be detectable with Earth technology. Your governments will notice." The implications hung in the air between them. Their temporary sanctuary couldn't last if authorities detected unusual transmissions from this region. Miles away, in a nondescript government building outside of Las Vegas, technical analyst Elena Vasquez frowned at her monitor. The anomalous atmospheric readings from 2 nights ago had been flagged for follow-up, but sandstorms weren't unusual in the Mojave. What had caught her attention was the momentary radiation spike that preceded the weather event, a pattern inconsistent with natural phenomena. "Director Wallace," she called, gesturing her supervisor over. "I think you should see this." Wallace, a stern-faced man with military bearing, studied the data without expression. "Satellite imagery? Compromised by the storm, sir. But I've tasked our nearest surveillance drone to do a sweep of the coordinates." Wallace nodded. "Do it quietly. If it's nothing, fine. If it's something." He left the sentence unfinished, but the implication was clear. Back at the crash site, Lyra suddenly tensed, her hands stilling over the exposed circuitry. "What is it?" Marcus asked, instantly alert. "Something scanning this area." Her voice was tight. "Primitive technology, but effective enough. We need to leave. Now." They hastily secured the ship, recovering it with sand as best they could. The sense of being watched intensified as they worked, though the desert remained still and silent around them. The drive back to the cabin was tense, both scanning the skies for signs of surveillance. Marcus took a circuitous route, using dry creek beds and natural features to mask their trail. "They'll find it eventually," he said when they were safely inside. "Your ship?" Lyra nodded, her expression solemn as she connected components they'd salvaged to her communication device. "Yes. The question is what happens when they do. What will your people do when you contact them? Will they come for you?" The question had been haunting him since their kiss, the uncertain future that loomed beyond this unexpected connection. Her violet eyes met his, something vulnerable flickering in their depths. "Our protocols for compromised missions are clear. Extraction is priority, with minimal contact." "Minimal contact," Marcus repeated, the words tasting bitter. "Is that what this is?" Lyra set down her tools, moving to stand before him. The air between them charged with that now familiar bioelectric current. "You know it isn't. What's happening between us was never part of any protocol." His hands found her waist, drawing her closer. "And what exactly is happening between us, Lyra?" "Something impossible," she whispered, her lips a breath away from his. "Something I should be documenting as a researcher but instead am experiencing as." "As what?" he prompted when she hesitated. "As simply myself," she finished, closing the distance between them. Their second kiss deepened quickly, months of understanding compressed into days, creating an intimacy that defied their different origins. His hands traced the contours of her back while hers slipped beneath his shirt to explore warm skin. Each touch amplified the bioelectric connection, creating sensations beyond physical pleasure, memories shared, emotions conveyed without words, a breaking down of barriers both cellular and cosmic. A sharp electronic pulse from the communication device interrupted them, its screen now glowing with symbols unfamiliar to Marcus. Lyra reluctantly pulled away, her breathing uneven. "It's working," she said, moving to the device. Her fingers danced across its surface, entering a complex sequence. "What are you telling them?" Marcus asked, still dazed from their encounter. She paused, conflict evident in her expression. The truth. That my ship is damaged. That Earth authorities will likely discover it soon. Her eyes met his. That extraction needs to happen quickly. The message sent with a soft chime, disappearing into the vast darkness outside their windows. Lyra's shoulders slumped slightly, the weight of what she'd done, and what she hadn't said, evident in her posture. How long? Marcus asked quietly. If they received it? 2 Earth days, perhaps 3, before they can position a recovery vessel. The cabin seemed suddenly smaller, the future pressing in from all sides. Outside, a distant mechanical whine grew gradually louder, the unmistakable sound of an aircraft approaching. They found us, Marcus said, moving to the window. A black helicopter was visible against the star-filled sky, searchlights sweeping the desert floor below. Their time was running out from both directions, Earth authorities closing in, and Lyra's people preparing extraction. Whatever was happening between them now existed in a rapidly closing window, making each moment more precious and each decision more consequential. Lyra joined him at the window, her hand finding his. Whatever happens, she said, echoing his words from earlier, I am changed by knowing you. The helicopter's searchlight swept closer to the cabin, the beam cutting through the darkness like a harbinger of separation to come. The helicopter's searchlight sliced through the darkness, illuminating the desert in harsh white bands that crept ever closer to Marcus's cabin. Inside, they moved with practiced efficiency, gathering only essentials, the repaired communication device, Marcus's emergency cache, and a few supplies stuffed hurriedly into a backpack. My truck's in the lean-to behind the cabin, Marcus said, shrugging on a jacket. If we keep to the ravine, the helicopter won't spot us immediately. Lyra nodded, her movements deliberate despite the urgency. She paused at the kitchen counter, touching the coffee mug she'd used that morning, a simple human artifact that now held significance beyond its function. Your government will question you when they finally find you. Your life here is over because of me. Marcus took her hand, the bioelectric current between them now a familiar comfort. My life here was just existence. The past 2 days have been living. He squeezed her fingers gently. No regrets. They slipped out the back door as the helicopter circled lower, its spotlight now directly illuminating the front of the cabin. Marcus led them down a narrow path worn into the rocky soil, staying low and using the natural contours of the land for cover. The ravine he'd mentioned appeared as a dark gash in the earth, deep enough to conceal their movement if they stayed low. The truck, an older model without electronic systems that could be easily tracked, started on the first try. They drove without headlights until they were miles from the cabin, using the moonlight and Marcus's intimate knowledge of the terrain to guide them. Where are we going? Lyra asked as the first hints of dawn appeared on the horizon. Ghost town about 80 miles east, Marcus replied, eyes fixed on the rugged path ahead. Old mining settlement. Abandoned decades ago but has some structures still standing. Good place to wait for. He hesitated. For whatever comes next. The unspoken question hung between them, would she leave with her people when they arrived, or stay in a world that would likely study her as a specimen rather than accept her as a visitor? They reached the ghost town as full daylight broke over the desert. A cluster of weathered wooden buildings stood like sentinels from another time, windows dark and empty, roofs partially collapsed. Marcus parked the truck behind what had once been a general store, concealing it from aerial view. Inside the old building, dust motes danced in the sunlight that streamed through gaps in the walls. Lyra set up the communication device on a worn counter, checking for responses while Marcus secured their temporary shelter. Anything? He asked, returning from his survey of the perimeter. Lyra's expression was complex, relief mingled with something that looked remarkably like regret. They received my transmission. A recovery vessel has already been dispatched. She looked up at him. 26 hours until arrival. Just over one Earth day left together. The knowledge settled between them like a physical presence. Then we have time, Marcus said quietly, crossing to her. His hand cupped her cheek, thumb tracing the subtle luminescence that pulsed beneath her skin. Time to make memories that will have to last across galaxies. Their lips met with newfound urgency, the knowledge of their limited time together stripping away hesitation. The bioelectric current flowed stronger than before, creating a feedback loop of sensation that blurred the boundaries between their separate selves. Clothing became an unnecessary barrier, removed with reverent care as they explored the similarities and differences in their physical forms. Lyra's skin glowed more intensely wherever Marcus touched her, responsive to his caresses in ways that transcended human experience. His body, in turn, became a canvas for her exploration, each touch transmitting not just physical pleasure but emotional connection that required no translation. Their joining was both alien and utterly natural, two beings finding harmony despite evolving on worlds light-years apart. The abandoned building filled with soft sounds of discovery and connection, dust and time momentarily suspended around them as they created their own universe within its walls. Afterward, they lay entwined on Marcus's unrolled sleeping bag, her head resting on his chest as he traced patterns along her shoulder. "Will you remember Earth?" he asked softly. "Remember this?" Lyra propped herself up on one elbow, her violet eyes serious. "My species has perfect recall. Every moment since the storm is preserved exactly as it happened." Her fingers traced his lips. "But memory isn't the question that matters now." He knew what she meant. The choice looming before them had gained weight and substance with each passing hour, with each new layer of intimacy discovered between them. "You could stay," Marcus said, giving voice to the possibility that had been growing in his mind. "We could go somewhere remote. Change identities." "Hunted by your government," she countered gently. "And my biology would eventually betray me to your medical establishments." "Or I could go with you," he suggested, the words emerging before he'd fully considered their implications. "Is that possible?" Lyra's expression shifted through several emotions. "It has never been done. The physiological adaptations required would be extensive. Our atmosphere, gravity, solar radiation, all different from what your body evolved to tolerate." She touched his face. "But our science could accommodate such changes, given time and resources." The possibilities expanded between them, a human among aliens, or an alien among humans. Neither easy, both fraught with sacrifice. Night fell over the ghost town, their discussion continuing as stars appeared in the vast desert sky. The communication device chimed softly, displaying new symbols. "The recovery vessel will arrive at midnight tomorrow," Lyra translated. "At these coordinates?" Marcus nodded, studying the map she showed him. "That gives us most of tomorrow to decide." But morning brought new complications. The distant sound of engines disturbed their brief sleep, not aircraft this time, but ground vehicles approaching steadily. From the upper window of their shelter, they watched as 3 black SUVs stopped at the edge of the ghost town. Men in tactical gear emerged, moving with military precision as they began a systematic search of the abandoned buildings. "Government agents," Marcus whispered. "We need to move. Now." They gathered their few belongings silently, slipping out through a rear window and using the decaying structures for cover as they made their way to higher ground behind the settlement. The truck was too risky now, it would be spotted immediately on the open desert. By midday, they had taken refuge in a narrow cave set into the rocky hills overlooking the ghost town. The search continued below, expanding outward in concentric circles from the abandoned settlement. "They must have tracked the communication signal," Lyra said, her face drawn with concern. "I've endangered you further." Marcus shook his head, passing her their dwindling water supply. "We still have options. After dark, we can try to circle around them, find another vehicle." The hours passed with agonizing slowness, the temperature in the cave rising to nearly unbearable levels before beginning to cool as sunset approached. They spoke little, conserving energy and water, but their hands remained linked, the bioelectric connection now as necessary as breathing. As twilight fell, Lyra's communication device displayed new information. "The recovery coordinates have changed," she said, studying the screen. "My people must have detected the government presence. They've moved the extraction point further into the wilderness." "How far?" Marcus asked. 15 miles northeast. "We can't reach it on foot before midnight." The moment of decision had arrived, forced by circumstances rather than choice. Marcus looked out at the darkening desert, then back at the woman who had literally fallen from the stars into his life. "I'm coming with you," he said, the words firm and final. "If your people will allow it." Lyra's eyes widened. "Marcus, the adjustments to your physiology can happen there as easily as here," he finished. "Look at what's waiting for me on Earth now, interrogation, probably imprisonment for aiding you. Or a life on the run." He took her hands in his. "I'd rather face the unknown with you than the known without you." Her expression softened, luminescence brightening beneath her skin. "My people value knowledge above all else. A willing human observer would be unprecedented. It might be enough to convince them." As full darkness descended, they made their final preparations. The narrow window of opportunity would come when the search teams rotated positions, a brief gap in coverage they'd observed throughout the day. "Are you certain?" Lyra asked one last time as they prepared to leave their shelter. "Once we're on that vessel, Earth becomes part of your past." Marcus looked back at the ghost town below, the black SUVs with their government insignia, the desert that had been his refuge and was now a trap. Then he looked at Lyra, alien and yet more familiar to his soul than any human had ever been. "My future is with you," he said simply. "Whatever galaxy that takes us to." Hand in hand, they slipped from the cave into the desert night, moving northeast toward their rendezvous with the recovery vessel. Behind them, searchlights crisscrossed the terrain they'd just vacated. Ahead lay uncertainty, adaptation, and discovery, a journey unprecedented in human experience. Above them, a new star appeared in the sky, growing brighter as it descended toward the designated coordinates. Not a star at all, but a vessel coming to bring one of its own home, and perhaps, if courage and love proved persuasive enough, to accept an unexpected passenger whose heart had already made the journey to another world. The desert that had once seemed empty to Marcus now revealed its final gift, a pathway to the stars, guided by a connection that had bridged the vast distances between worlds against all odds and expectations.